Hello, my dear listener. I'm reaching out to you from the other side of the screen. I hope you enjoy my content. Please give a like or a dislike so I know if my work interests you. I would be very happy to have you subscribe to the channel. Let's go, buddy. When I first stepped into the halls of Briarsville Clinic, the air felt heavy. It wasn't something I could easily explain, just a sense that the walls had witnessed more suffering than any building should. The place was old, with high ceilings and narrow corridors, and the smell, a mix of disinfectant and dampness, felt suffocating. I had been offered a job as an orderly, cleaning, delivering meals, maintaining order. I accepted without hesitation. I needed the money and was looking for a way to escape my past. Dr. Bailey was the first staff member I noticed. She moved quickly, almost silently, and always seemed to know exactly where she belonged. Cold, confident, she radiated an authority that intimidated anyone who dared to hold her gaze for too long. Her sharp features and piercing eyes made you want to look away immediately. I knew right away she didn't care who I was. To her, I was just another cog in her machine. My first shift went smoothly. The patients were calm, though the clinic itself felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Occasionally, it felt like someone was watching me, even when the corridors were empty. By the evening, I was getting used to the routine, cleaning rooms, delivering meals, sorting laundry. Everything seemed fairly ordinary until I noticed something strange. Patients were disappearing, not all at once and not obviously. At first, it was easy to miss. There were so many patients, and people were discharged or transferred daily. But one patient, a quiet woman in her 50s, whom I had seen that morning, had simply vanished. Her bed was neatly made, and her name had disappeared from the records. I assumed she had been moved to another facility. Over the next few weeks, though, I started noticing more oddities. At night, the hallways echoed with sounds that didn't belong, whispering, sometimes muffled sobbing. Patients occasionally complained about hearing screams from the neighboring rooms. I didn't believe them. Then I heard the scream myself. It was late one night during my shift. The sound was short but piercing, like someone crying out in unbearable pain before falling silent. I froze, but the sound didn't come again. The next morning, one of the more anxious patients looked utterly drained. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling, but I didn't ask him what happened. His expression made it clear he didn't want to talk about it. Her presence was always palpable, even from a distance. She moved through the clinic as though everything in it belonged to her. I watched her work with patience. She would sit across from them for long periods, as if she were delving into their minds. I couldn't see exactly what she did, but the patients who emerged from her sessions always looked different. Some seemed hollowed out, like something vital had been ripped from them. Others appeared eerily calm, as if sedated by something invisible. I soon realized that tension followed her everywhere. Patients disappeared more frequently here than in any other clinic, but no one asked questions. Perhaps out of fear, perhaps because her icy, almost detached demeanor left no room for objections. With each passing day, I felt more certain that the clinic was hiding something. I couldn't put my finger on it, but a sense of unease grew stronger. I didn't share my observations with anyone. It was easy to dismiss everything as fatigue or overactive imagination. But one thought rooted itself in my mind. The patients' disappearances and the oppressive atmosphere of the clinic were connected, and Dr. Bailey was at the center of it all. Back then, I could have left. No one would have stopped me, but I stayed, and that decision was my first step into the abyss. At Bryersville Clinic, patients came and went, but one vanished woman remained etched in my memory. Her name slipped from my mind quickly, but her face was unforgettable. Thin, with hollow eyes, she always sat by the window, staring out at a world she was never allowed to rejoin. She hardly spoke, her presence so faint it took me weeks to realize she was gone. Her disappearance was explained simply. She had been transferred to another facility. It sounded plausible. At the time, I didn't think to question it. But that day, I couldn't help but notice how unusually quiet the room felt where she used to sit. It was as if her absence had drained the very air from the space. I continued with my duties, telling myself it was just the normal rhythm of the clinic where patients left and new ones arrived. But deep down, I knew something didn't add up. A few more days passed before something happened during a night shift that shook me to my core. It was an ordinary evening until I heard a noise. It came from a room at the far end of the hall. It wasn't a scream or a cry, but a strange, rhythmic thumping, like someone tapping against a wall. I approached the room. The door was locked. The light inside was off, but a faint glow seeped through the crack beneath the door, as if a dim lantern was flickering within. I wanted to walk away, but my curiosity got the better of me. Placing my hand on the door, I felt a faint warmth emanating from it, barely perceptible. It didn't make sense. Bryersville was always cold. I stood there for a few seconds, frozen, until the sound stopped. Then I quickly left, convincing myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, I found out there was no longer a patient in that room. Another disappearance. No one on the staff said a word. It was as if that person had never existed. I began paying closer attention to how often patients vanished. Not every week, but frequently enough that it couldn't be ignored. They all shared one common trait. Each had spent long hours alone with Dr. Bailey before they disappeared. She never seemed disturbed by these occurrences. Her calm, detached demeanor silenced everyone around her. None of the staff, myself included, asked questions. It was as if the clinic itself suppressed any attempts to uncover the truth. The more I worked there, the stronger my unease grew. At night, the clinic's hallways felt longer than they did during the day. Shadows in the corners seemed denser, as though they were hiding something. Everything around me felt like a web, with Dr. Bailey at its center. I started to notice that she avoided being alone with the staff. Patients, on the other hand, often spent hours with her. They emerged from her sessions looking drained, broken, and in the most unsettling cases, they didn't emerge at all. These thoughts gnawed at me, but I tried to suppress them. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just tired or creating problems where there were none. I should have left then. Every instinct screamed at me to walk away, but I didn't. I convinced myself it was nothing, that it wasn't my concern. At that point, I still believed I could stay out of it. One night, I was jolted awake by a nightmare. I couldn't recall what I had dreamed, but I woke drenched in cold sweat, my heart pounding. The clinic was silent, except for the distant sound of dripping water. I got up to check the hallways. Everything seemed normal, except for the strange, trembling sensation that wouldn't leave me. It felt like someone was watching me, following me, but there was no one there. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just a restless night. I wanted to forget, but deep inside, the feeling grew that I was part of something terrible. At the time, I didn't know how far I would go, but that moment marked the beginning. It was my first encounter with true fear, a fear that lingered even in the daylight. Working at Bryersville Clinic was like sinking into a swamp. The longer you stayed, the deeper it pulled you in. At first, you just did your job, turning a blind eye to the strange occurrences, convincing yourself it wasn't your concern. But one day, you realize you're trapped, unable to break free. It had been 10 years since my first shift. I never intended to stay that long. Every year, I told myself it would be the last, that I'd find another job. But I never did. Maybe I was scared. Maybe the clinic itself wouldn't let me go. Dr. Bailey remained unchanged. She didn't age, didn't falter, and never showed any sign of concern. Everything about her exuded absolute confidence and authority. But by then, I knew more. Patients continued to disappear. Not frequently, but often enough for me to connect the dots. All the missing patients had one thing in common. In the days or weeks before their disappearance, they spent extended time with Dr. Bailey. Her offices had become like black holes. People entered but never came out. At first, I avoided getting involved in her work, but over time, she began pulling me into her tasks. At first, it was small things: organizing files, preparing rooms, retrieving items from her office. Each errand filled me with a cold dread, especially when it involved her office. The room was impeccably neat, every item perfectly in its place. On the surface, it was just a workspace, but I felt an unsettling presence lingering there, as though the room itself was alive with secrets. Then came the day I disposed of my first body. It was a young woman. Her face was frozen in terror, her eyes wide open. There were no visible signs of strangulation or injuries on her skin, but she was undeniably dead. Dr. Bailey ordered me to get rid of her and to keep quiet. She said it without emotion, as though it were just another part of my job. I obeyed. I couldn't say a word. I simply grabbed the gurney, wrapped the body in a sheet, and wheeled it to the basement. I can still hear the sound of the wheels squeaking against the floor and remember the icy chill of the room where I left her. After that, everything changed. Assisting with her work became part of my job. Disposing of bodies, cleaning up rooms, destroying documents. She never offered explanations, and I never asked. I became her shadow, and everything she did became a part of my existence. Each death left its mark on me. At first, it was just sleepless nights. Then came the intrusive thoughts. I started drinking to drown out the memories, but it didn't help. The more time I spent at the clinic, the more I realized I couldn't leave. This place had swallowed me whole, and Dr. Bailey was its heart. At night, I began to notice strange things. The clinic's walls seemed to shift as if they were alive. Sometimes I thought I saw shadows moving faster than they should. The sounds in the hallways became routine: moans, screams, even whispers. The staff ignored it. So did I. But deep down, I knew this was more than just a clinic. It was alive. I understood that sooner or later, it had to end. Either I would lose my mind, or I would have to do something to escape. But I couldn't bring myself to act. Every day became indistinguishable from the last. The terror became a background noise in my life, as familiar as the air I breathed. From the moment I started working with Dr. Bailey, I knew I was doing something wrong. But 10 years later, I no longer knew who I was. An orderly, an accomplice, a victim. The only thing I knew for certain was that this darkness would never end unless I stopped it myself. The routine at Bryersville Clinics was oppressively predictable. Patients came and went as always, and I, as usual, performed my duties in silence, avoiding questions. But one day, someone arrived who changed everything. His name was Harold. He came to the clinic in late autumn. Tall, with sunken cheeks and a dull gaze, he didn't stand out among the other patients. At first glance, he was just another broken man, crushed by his own mind, like so many I had seen here before. He was placed in a room at the far end of the hall, closer to the exit, and for a while he barely drew attention. But there was something strange about him. Harold didn't behave like the other patients, who either sought connection or withdrew completely. He observed people carefully, almost challengingly, and sometimes, as I walked past his room, I felt his gaze follow me, as though he knew something I didn't. At first, I chalked it up to paranoia. Working in the clinic had made me suspicious of everyone, especially new arrivals. But Harold was different. He wasn't afraid of anyone, not even Dr. Bailey. I noticed it 3 days after he arrived. Most patients avoided her gaze, as if they could sense the danger radiating from her. But Harold, on the other hand, met her eyes directly when they passed each other in the hall. His stare was cold, almost disdainful. Dr. Bailey didn't seem to react, or at least she didn't show it. She didn't tolerate defiance, not even in the form of a silent challenge. But I caught a small tell. Her fingers twitched ever so slightly as Harold walked by. Each day I caught him watching me more often. At first, I tried to ignore it, but it became clear he was doing it deliberately. He looked at me like he knew something, like he was waiting for something. When I passed his room, he would sometimes stand by the door, always in the same position, as if anticipating my approach. It happened so often that I stopped believing it was coincidence. I began avoiding him. I could feel his presence disrupting the fragile order I had grown accustomed to over the past decade. But deep down, I knew he was here for a reason. A week after his arrival, I noticed Dr. Bailey paying him more attention. It wasn't overt, but I knew her well enough to sense it. She didn't pass his room casually anymore, and her gaze lingered on him longer than usual. She didn't rush to work with him directly. Normally, she would summon patients for her sessions right away, but something held her back with Harold. I didn't know what it was, but I could tell he unsettled her. Harold began speaking to the other patients. I overheard snippets of his conversations as I passed their rooms. His voice was low but deliberate, as though he was saying something important, something they couldn't afford to miss. Sometimes, if I listened closely, I could hear the other patients responding, not with words, but in whispers, as if afraid of being overheard. After several nights of this, the clinic's atmosphere grew tense. Patients were talking to each other more, and I felt as though they were waiting for something. One day, as I walked past Harold's room, he quietly said my name. It was the first time in all my years at the clinic that a patient had addressed me directly, not as a faceless orderly, but as a person. I didn't stop, but inside, everything froze. How could he know my name? I had never introduced myself, and no patient could have told him. After that, I couldn't ignore him anymore. This man knew something about me, about the clinic, maybe even about Dr. Bailey. Harold had become the center of something I couldn't yet understand. The patients listened to him, and Dr. Bailey's attention was drawn to him more and more. The very atmosphere of the clinic seemed to shift, as though Harold's presence had disrupted its foundation. I didn't know then that Harold wasn't just another patient. He came here with a purpose to dismantle everything Dr. Bailey had built. I was a witness to it, but I had no idea it was only the beginning. The clinic was never a place for surprises. Every day felt like a carbon copy of the one before, and every patient fit seamlessly into the oppressive atmosphere of despair. But Harold was different. He disrupted the order of this place. His presence was too noticeable, his actions too deliberate. At first, it was subtle. He spoke to other patients, asking questions that left them visibly unsettled. Then, things started happening that were impossible to ignore. One of the patients, usually quiet and withdrawn, suddenly began pounding on the walls of his room. His screams echoed through the building, and I rushed to help, as I always did. When I opened the door, he froze at the sight of me. His face was a mixture of fear and something else I couldn't identify. He didn't say a word, but his gaze was fixed on something over my shoulder. I turned to look, but there was no one there. The next day, that patient was gone. His room was empty, and no trace of his belongings remained to suggest he had ever been there. Dr. Bailey was growing increasingly tense. Her flawless composure began to crack. I noticed her glancing toward Harold's room more often as she walked by. Her steps, usually quick and purposeful, slowed as if she was hesitating. But the most unsettling changes were in her office. When I entered on her orders, I saw her poring over her notes, something she never used to do. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote in her notebook, a rare and telling sign of her unease. I heard Harold say my name again. It was late at night as I cleaned the hallway. His voice came from his room, and it sounded as though he had known me his entire life. This time I stopped. Without knowing why, I approached the door and cracked it open. He was sitting on the bed. His face was calm, but his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that seemed to pierce my very soul. I didn't want to enter, but something in his gaze held me there. Without a word, he extended his hand and placed a piece of paper on the bed. I didn't take it immediately. Hours later, when his room was empty, I mustered the courage to go inside and see what he had left. It was an old, faded note. Just a few words. The curse begins where fear takes hold. I didn't know what it meant, but the words lodged themselves in my mind. It felt important, like something he needed me to understand while I still could. In the days that followed, the clinic grew increasingly chaotic. Patients became restless. Some refused to eat, while others whispered to each other, barely acknowledging the presence of anyone else. One patient, a middle-aged man with acute paranoia, began loudly proclaiming that the clinic was dying. His words unsettled the other patients and made the staff avoid him. A few days later, he disappeared too. Dr. Bailey grew darker, her usual cold demeanor giving way to a tension that everyone around her could feel. She seemed braced for something none of us could anticipate. Harold began wandering the hallways. His presence was no longer confined to his room. He moved slowly and silently, but every time I saw him, the air around him seemed heavier. Patients hid as he passed, but I couldn't tell if they were afraid of him or if they were listening to him. One day, I saw him stop outside Dr. Bailey's office. He didn't do anything. He just stood there, staring at the door. I watched from a distance, too afraid to move. After a minute, he walked away, leaving a suffocating silence in his wake. I began to realize that Harold wasn't here by accident. He wasn't like the other patients. His arrival was part of something bigger, something that threatened all of us. I didn't know then that Harold already knew the truth, that he had come here to dismantle everything Dr. Bailey had built over the years. But I could feel it. This was the beginning of the end, and I would no longer be able to remain on the sidelines. Dr. Bailey's influence was like an invisible web, unseen but palpable. It enveloped everyone who entered the clinic, compelling them to obey, often without realizing it. But with Harold's arrival, that web began to unravel. The clinic had changed. The silence, once an intrinsic part of its oppressive atmosphere, now felt like the calm before a storm. Whispers in the hallways grew louder. Patients looked at one another with unease, and the staff avoided conversations altogether. Harold moved through the clinic like a figure from a dream, silent, deliberate, yet every step he took seemed to herald something ominous. The patients were the first to break. At first, it was small acts of defiance. One refused to enter Dr. Bailey's office, struggling against the orderly's grip. Another deliberately threw his food tray on the floor, declaring nothing here matters anymore. But soon, these outbursts became organized. Patients gathered in small groups, whispering as they cast furtive glances toward Dr. Bailey's office. They avoided her, but their fear began to shift into something else, something simmering beneath the surface, like restrained fury. Harold was always at the center of these changes. His words, which I occasionally overheard in passing, were simple yet piercing. They seemed to lift the veil that had blinded the patients to the reality around them. Dr. Bailey was no longer untouchable. I noticed her spending longer hours in her office, her movements growing sharper, her face more strained. The icy composure that had held the clinic in a vice grip for so long was beginning to crack. She responded with escalating harshness. She ordered the staff to use physical restraint more frequently and to isolate patients who were talking too much. But her attempts to reassert control only made things worse. The patients were no longer as afraid of her as they once were. One night, I found a note left by Harold. It was tucked onto my cart, hidden among the folded sheets. It contained only one sentence: "Fear disappears when you see its essence." The words stopped me in my tracks. There was something hauntingly familiar about them. They brought back memories of my first days at the clinic, the trembling voices of patients, their whispers about a shadow that was everywhere. But what if the fear wasn't in the clinic itself? What if it was in us? That same night, Harold confronted Dr. Bailey in the hallway. I was there, hiding in the shadows. I couldn't hear their exchange, but their stances and expressions said it all. Dr. Bailey stood rigid, her hands clenched tightly as if holding back a storm of rage. Harold, in contrast, appeared calm, almost indifferent. They stared at each other for several long moments before Bailey took a step forward. I expected Harold to back down, but he didn't. He stood firm, and for the first time, I saw her confidence falter. Without a word, she turned and walked away, leaving the hallway steeped in tense silence. After that, the patients grew bolder. They pounded on walls, shouted phrases they had once murmured in secrecy. Harold moved among them like a ghost, never touching, yet leaving a profound impact in his wake. Dr. Bailey stopped leaving her office entirely. It was as if she knew her power was slipping away, but had no idea how to stop it. It was then that I realized Harold wasn't just a man. He was someone, or something, sent to dismantle the clinic from within. But I couldn't tell whether he was doing it for us or for himself. The night everything fell apart began like any other. I went through my usual routine, checking the hallways, distributing medications, and trying to ignore the rising tension that had taken hold of the clinic. But something in the air felt different. It was as though the walls, which had always been silent, were now listening. The patients were restless. Even the quietest among them paced their rooms, as if bracing for something terrible. Their eyes darted around, scanning shadows I couldn't see. But what frightened me most was Harold. He stood in the center of his room, as though awaiting a moment only he could foresee. His arms hung loosely at his sides, and his gaze was distant. He looked prepared for something monumental, though I had no idea what it might be. Dr. Bailey appeared in the hallway just before midnight. It was rare for her to be out at night. She usually avoided unnecessary contact. Her face was grim, and in her hands she held a small object I had often seen in her office. I didn't know what it was, an amulet, an old relic, or perhaps just a trinket, but she always treated it with care, as though it were her talisman. She walked toward Harold's room. I saw them meet in the hallway. It wasn't just an encounter, it was something far greater. The atmosphere thickened around them, as though the very air held its breath. Harold stood still, his face calm and composed. Dr. Bailey stepped closer, and though I couldn't hear her voice, her posture screamed menace. But Harold didn't retreat. He raised his hand and pointed at her, as though accusing her of something. Her face twisted with fury, and for the first time, I saw something in her that wasn't human. It wasn't just anger. It was the embodiment of fear and malice she had concealed for years. The moment their gazes locked, the clinic itself seemed to react. Rustling sounds echoed through the walls. Doors creaked as though someone was opening them from the other side. Patients began screaming, pounding on their doors in panic. I saw Dr. Bailey tremble, her hands gripping the object so tightly I thought it might shatter. Harold remained unmoving, but his presence grew heavier, more overwhelming. I remembered Harold's notes, his words about fear. Everything happening around us was tied to him, his resolve, his strength. It was challenging the very force that had kept the clinic in terror for so long. But I knew he couldn't end it alone. Something needed to be done, something crucial. Then I saw it. The object fell from Dr. Bailey's hands. It tumbled to the floor and rolled toward me. I don't know what compelled me to act. Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps it was anger at everything I had endured over the years. But I picked it up. The object was cold and unnaturally heavy, as though it carried the weight of the entire clinic's darkness. I realized it was the key, the source of her power, her curse. She turned to me, her eyes blazing with hatred, but behind it, I saw fear. I swung my arm and hurled the object against the wall. It shattered with a dull crack, and in that instant, everything around us seemed to erupt. The lights flickered violently. Patients screamed, but their cries now sounded different, as though they were releasing something, not succumbing to fear. Dr. Bailey let out a monstrous roar, not human but animalistic. She collapsed to her knees, clutching her head. Harold stepped forward, and for the first time his face showed satisfaction. The clinic exhaled. I can't describe it any other way. It was as though the building itself had been freed, as though something dark had finally left it. When it was over, the clinic fell into complete silence. The patients, who had been screaming and thrashing moments before, now looked drained but calm. Dr. Bailey lay on the floor. She was alive but motionless. Her eyes were hollow, as though something vital had been taken from her. Harold was gone. I don't know how or where, but when I turned to where he had been standing, there was nothing. I stood in the stillness, realizing that whatever had held us captive for so long was finally broken. But even as relief washed over me, I couldn't shake the feeling that Harold's presence had been more than chance. He had come for a reason, but whether it was for our sake or his own, I would never know. When it was over, I felt silence for the first time in 10 years, silence that didn't weigh me down. It wasn't oppressive, it was empty, like a room after a storm. The clinic seemed transformed. Even the air felt different, lighter, freer. The patients gradually calmed. Some sat on their beds, staring into space while others wept, but their tears no longer carried the mark of fear. It was like waking from a long, harrowing nightmare. I walked the hallways. Everything looked the same, but I knew that was an illusion. The curse that had gripped the clinic was gone. Along with it, something else had vanished, something that had felt inseparable from the building itself. I found her in the same corridor where it had all happened. She sat on the floor, her back against the wall, staring blankly ahead. Her face was devoid of the cold, calculated expression it always bore. She no longer looked like the woman who had once ruled the clinic, bending it to her will. She was just a person, broken, lost, as if torn from time itself. I wanted to say something, but no words came. Instead, I left her there, knowing she was no longer a threat. Harold had vanished as suddenly as he had appeared. None of the patients knew where he had gone. None of the staff mentioned his name. It was as if he had never existed. But I knew he had been there. His presence lingered in the clinic, in the way the patients had changed, in the absence of the fear that had hung over this place for so long. I knew I couldn't stay. Even with the curse destroyed, the clinic was no longer a place I could endure. Too much of it reminded me of the years I had spent under Dr. Bailey's shadow. I left that same day without explaining myself to my colleagues. I changed out of my uniform, gathered my things, and walked out the door. Outside, it was a gray, overcast day. Rain drizzled onto the pavement, but even that felt cleansing. I turned back for one last look at the clinic, feeling as though I was leaving a part of myself behind. I lived in her shadow for 10 years. I helped her kill, covered her tracks, and in the end became part of her curse. But now I'm free. Although, freedom doesn't always bring relief. Weeks passed. I found a new job far from the city where the clinic was located. I lived alone, avoided conversations, and tried to forget. But the memories wouldn't let go. Sometimes I heard whispers in the dark, or caught a fleeting figure in the corner of my eye. I knew it was just my mind playing tricks, but the fear still lingered deep within me. I often thought about Harold. Who was he? Why had he come to the clinic? Was he human or something more? I would never find the answers, but one thing I knew for certain. Without him, I would never have left that place alive. One morning, I received a letter. It had no return address, and inside was a single slip of paper with one phrase: "Fear disappears when you see its essence." I smiled, though the smile was bitter. Harold, or whoever had sent it, was reminding me that even without the curse, fear was still a part of me. But now I could face it.